So this is a story about your brain. It's really going to be two stories today. The first is about what happens to your brain when you try to do two things at the same time, both of which seem simple, but in combination can produce deadly results. The second story is about what happens when you trade the technological for the natural. Now, we're going to start with the first story, but in preparation for the second, I want to give you a little task. What you see up here is a task of creativity. Your task is to think of these three words, same, tennis, and head, and try to think of one word that goes with all three. That one word might be part of a word compound, it might be conceptually similar, but I guarantee you that there is one word that joins all three of these together. We'll come back to that one a little bit later. I'll give you some time to think about it. Over the past 27 years, I've dedicated my life to trying to understand how we use our brain to navigate through the environment that we live in. I've worked with pedestrians, drivers, and pilots to try to understand how our vision and attention systems help us move about this very complex world that we live in. And for the last 17 years, I've been dedicated to a very specific issue, and that issue has been the issue of distracted driving. Because as we move around our environment, there's probably nothing more important than driving. 94% of crashes on our roadways today are due to human error. And understanding how our brain works in that very special environment is critical to our safety, health, and well-being. Now, there's no question, I think, everyone understands that distraction is killing us. When we think about all of the fatalities on the roadways in the United States, we start to begin to understand why our brain is so important. We lose about 40,000 people every year on our roads in the United States, and they're certainly not the safest in the world amongst industrialized countries. And there are some estimates by groups like the National Safety Council that 1/4 of those people are dying because people are using their phones while driving. And you don't need to see this yourself, though you might have, to really understand how compelling these devices are. This is a picture that one of my students sent me, and then she quickly wrote back and said, "Oh no, my boyfriend took it while I was driving. I didn't take the picture." But you see someone here that's engaged in kind of a paradox, right? This is someone who's doing something very dangerous. They're riding a motorcycle, and they're doing something equally dangerous. They're doing it in hands-free and eyes-free mode. And at the same time, this individual is wearing a helmet and they have a safety strap around their rucksack. So in one case, they're being safe, and in the other, they're being wildly unsafe. And I think understanding this and how compelling these devices are is really critical for all of us as we're trying to move around our world safely. Now, what's interesting about this is this really isn't a new research problem for people like me. In fact, the first study of this particular issue, using phones while driving, was published in 1969, which means the advisor and a grad student were probably doing this work when I was born in 1967. What that means is that we've been doing research on this issue for over 50 years. And when I tell you today and make the claim that using your phone while you're driving in any manner, hands-free, touching it, texting, just talking, is at best equivalent to driving drunk, I'm not saying it based upon a few studies. I'm saying it based upon numerous studies and numerous methodologies that we've been using over 50 years. Two of the best studies that I think really illustrate how much of a problem this is are what are called epidemiological studies. There are studies where people were actually in crashes. In one case, the crashes led to a visit to the emergency room. In another case, it did not. The crashes were in different countries. These studies were done by different researchers. But the bottom line is, across both studies, they found exactly the same thing. You are 4 times or more likely to be in a crash if you're using a phone in any manner. It doesn't matter in this study if the phone was being used handheld or hands-free. People were more likely to be in a crash, in fact, than a drunk driver is likely to be in a crash. And again, keep in mind, these are 2 studies done by 2 different groups of people at different points in time with actual crash victims. Now, speaking of drunk driving, if, like my friend Dave Strayer, you had a driving simulator in your laboratory and you brought people in at the University of Utah and got them drunk, and when I used to talk about this, I used to say they're on the Utah campus, so they're only a little drunk, and I gave a talk there last year, and Dave raised his hand and said, no, they were really drunk. And I said, okay. So if you were to bring people in and get them really drunk and then have them drive in your driving simulator, and then bring them back and have them drive sober, and while they're driving, you give them some events they'd have to react to, like a suddenly stopping car. You would find that people drive better when they're drunk. Think about that for a second. People drive better when they're drunk. The drunk drivers knew that they were impaired and knew that they were being watched, and so what they made sure to do is try to be as vigilant as possible. And when cars stopped in front of them, they were slower, but they tended to crush the brake pedal in response in order to stop. The drivers, those same drivers, when they came back and they were talking hands-free on a phone to someone that wasn't in that vehicle with them, drove through 4 vehicles without even noticing it. And when they were asked afterwards, how did you drive? They said, oh, much better when I was drunk. What about that car you drove through? No recollection whatsoever of that event. Because it turns out it takes your brain to drive. We've used a device that's used to measure older adult attention, which is how I really got started in this, is looking at older adults. And that device tells us that the attention of someone that's on a phone is so tapped out that they are at best 4 times slower to see and understand what's happening in that environment around them. 4 times as slow. In fact, when I do this task with a 19-year-old, they look like a fighter pilot, but when I give them a hands-free cellular conversation, they look like a 7-year-old adult with Alzheimer's disease. In Australia, they use this task to screen older drivers, and that profile would lead to that person probably losing their license. The reason why this is so hard is because your brain just doesn't have enough resources to do multiple things at the same time. I know multitasking's in. We've got some incredibly bright young adults here today. They're going to be talking about some amazing things, and in the back of their head right now they're thinking, yeah, but I've been doing this since I was 4, so my brain's totally different, right? No. The problem is all of our brains are the same. And with training, they're not getting any better. In fact, they're getting worse. When you look at the brain of an individual that's trying to talk and look at the world around them at the same time, you see something very compelling. This is an image of the brain. It's the back of your brain. This is occipital cortex, primary visual processing area. And that darker bit there, that red bit, that's essentially where blood is flowing, where neurons are active. It means your brain's doing stuff. And we can use this technique to understand which part of our brain is active and which isn't. On the left panel, you see the brain of someone that's been asked to look at a traffic scene, and just look at a traffic scene and try to process it. And primary visual processing area is lighting up. It looks like they're doing something. Then when that same person is asked to look at that traffic scene, but then listen to some simple sentences, and because they're going to be asked some simple true and false questions after that, they're not asked to give those answers till later, just listen. When that person listens, now that brain region turns off by 40%. The region of the brain that's responsible for seeing the world starts to deactivate, and regions that are responsible in temporal areas for listening start to activate. In other words, your brain doesn't have enough resources to go around to do both things at the same time. And the real-world implication of this is incredibly scary. I want you to imagine that you have a child playing on a sidewalk in an area like right here in Kansas City, maybe a grandchild or a son or a daughter or a sibling. What you would want for a driver driving down your residential neighborhood is that they would scan on the right side of the road for your kid playing on the sidewalk, or maybe a car getting ready to back out into the intersection. You'd want them to scan on the left to make sure that there were no sudden events like cars running in front of them at unexpected times. And like my grandmother taught me to drive, you would want them scanning the environment as far ahead, not just the car in front of them, but as many cars away as they could see. And what you're seeing here is the eye movement patterns of someone doing just that. That larger box, because those little dots there are eye trackers, so we can see where people are looking. That larger box is where an attentive driver is scanning for hazards, where your kid's playing, where cars might be stopping, where someone might come across the intersection unexpectedly. And here's what happens with that tapped out brain. When someone's asked to have a conversation with someone that's not in the vehicle with them, in-vehicle conversations are different because, as we all know, when you're driving in a complicated environment like under Bartle Hall here in Kansas City, the conversation stops, right? But when you're talking to someone that's not in the car with you, now because the brain is trying to allocate resources strategically, they're now scanning a region of space that is about the width of the steering wheel and about the distance of the front bumper of the car. That means when your son or daughter, your brother or sister, your niece or nephew, your grandchild runs off of the sidewalk into the street, they won't even be looking at the right place until that person is right under the front bumper of their car. And this helps explain why we're seeing this huge rise in fatalities and why we have crashes where people are completely not understanding why they missed it, because it seems like they're seeing everything, but they're actually not. Now, I could go on and on because we've been doing this for 50 years. This last year, we actually did a study of all of the research that's out there on distraction generally, looking at the effect of distraction on driving. And in that study, and since then there's another 100 studies that have come out, we looked at 342 studies that cover about 1,608 measures of distraction and about 20,000 people. I'm going to throw up a slightly complicated graph, but here's what I want you to get about it. What we did was we asked a simple question. Did the study show that there was a negative effect on performance, driving performance for that distraction? No effect, because science sometimes doesn't find things. Or did distraction actually improve performance? And here's the bottom line. When you're texting, almost every single time we measure it, we find that texting reduces driving performance. But even 9 times, that's that little thing in the middle there, even 9 times we didn't show texting affected driving performance, because science isn't perfect. Sometimes we don't find things. But when we look at hands held versus hands free, that larger piece of the pie on the middle and outer rings, 81% of the time, plus or minus 0.5%, we find that using a phone reduces your ability to drive safely. And it doesn't matter if it's hands held or hands free. The bottom line is we've been studying this for a decade and we've done hundreds of studies. I'm not just saying this because I think it's true. I'm saying this because the vast preponderance of evidence says that we're all putting each other at grave risk when we're using our phones to drive down the road and say, hey, where are you at? Again, the National Safety Council estimates of the 40,000 people that died this last year, and by the way, that's an increase. And we've been increasing for the last 2 years, and we're probably going to increase again this year. And that's despite the fact that our cars are safer with automatic braking and stability control and airbags. Our roads are safer because the engineers are designing them better. Our emergency services get to a crash faster. And when you get to the hospital, you're more likely to live. Despite all those safety improvements, more people are dying because of the ubiquity of phones in cars. And a quarter of the people, 10,000 people that died, probably died because someone was using a phone. Why do we do it? Why do we do it? You know, this is what's really fascinated me. I was a brain scientist who really studied why the brain was working, but I immediately, when I started to do this work, thought to myself, this is crazy. Why are people doing it? And I really started to study this problem. And really the bottom line is our brain is wired for smartphones. You're looking at fMRI again, but now I'm going to show you some fMRI images from areas of the brain that we call the dopaminergic system. This is the reward system. Now I can see everyone. So raise your hand if you love folding laundry. Please raise your hand. Who loves folding laundry? Ooh, I've got 3 people. This is amazing. All right, great. Usually it takes about 500 and I can get 1, so that's good. If I were to ask the audience, you know, even if you don't love folding laundry, give me one word that describes how you feel when you're done folding a basket of laundry. Think about it for a second. You do the laundry, it sits there in the basket, you walk by it on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you finally fold laundry. How do you feel? At that moment, you'd probably say, yeah, I feel accomplished. I feel like I did something. I have a sense of accomplishment. You feel good. And what you're feeling there is this dopaminergic system, this reward system that is designed to get you to fold that darn laundry the next time. It rewards you to reinforce behaviors to get you to repeat them. And what this image is showing, this is the image of the brain on Facebook. Because what it's showing is the dopaminergic system kicks in big time whenever we do something social. And what's really interesting, those little bars down there, the red bars and the blue bars, big bar means more activity. That's the bar of someone that's actually talking about themselves versus someone that's just talking. In other words, we love to talk about ourselves. So this is why Facebook is so popular, because you get to like things and tell people what your opinion is and where you've been and Instagram your lunch. So our brain is wired for this kind of stuff. And there are smart people where I grew up in Silicon Valley that are designing these things to attract and grab your attention whether you want it to or not. because that's the business model. When we ask people to put these things down, like we do for journalism students at the University of Kansas for 24 to 48 hours, these are the kind of reactions you get. And I think it tells you something about the deep connection of our brain to this stuff. People look addicted. And in fact, we've done some work on addiction, and I will tell you, there are some people that are legitimately addicted to their smartphones. I had one young woman, when I gave this talk, say, I lost my phone for a while, and I felt like I was missing an arm. I was handicapped. But what if I told you that the reason we do this is because your brain is, in fact, pulling a trick on you? We fool ourselves in lots of different ways. We think of our brain as a really complex supercomputer, but it's not. We've got billions of neurons and trillions of connections, multiple areas dedicated to processing speech and music and love. We can build tools to go into space. But I'll tell you, if you study it long enough, it's a lot more like this. It does a few things really well, but everything it doesn't do very well, it sort of disguises from you. And I need to convince you of this fact because I believe your life is at risk if you don't believe me. When you drive down the road, you think you see everything. We call perception the grand illusion because you think you have this 180-degree, full-color, motion-based, high-definition, three-dimensional panorama available to you at all times. But everyone hold your fist out at arm's length. Look at your fist. See your fist? That's about how much information you're processing in the visual world at any one time. You're driving down the road and you think you see the woman on the right getting ready to walk in the street and the SUV and the people stopping, but really you have this little tiny window that you're sort of moving around and you're sort of building up an image of what you see. You don't see everything at the same time. And I'm going to convince you of this. I'm going to show you some work we did with actual drivers driving in Chicago. So we took pictures of driving scenes and we asked folks to look at these driving scenes. And what we did was we manipulated the driving scene. So I want you to look at this as a driver. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually change something in the scene, and you have to just raise your hand when you spot it. And I'm running out of time, so we'll move on. Here we go. Just spot the change in the driving scene and raise your hand when you see it, drivers. Uh-oh. Oh, I've got one. Good. I'll drive home with you. That's good. 2, 3. We are limited on time, so I'll give you a couple more seconds. Okay, great, good. And you also like folding laundry. It's like a double win. That's fantastic. Okay, if you've looked at that 50-mile-an-hour sign on the left a few times, take a look at it again. Do you see that 20-story apartment building right next to it that's appearing and disappearing? There it is. There it goes. There it is. There it goes. Everyone see it now? All right, now you're saying to yourself, that's not fair. You tricked me. And I did trick you. I tricked you because I started talking to you about driving, and your attention system is limited. So it immediately went into a mode of being efficient and said, I'm going to look for driving things. And so it looked at that car right in front of you, and you said, well, there's nothing happening there. So then it looked at the car that was nearby. Don't see anything happening there. You then moved your eyes, looked at the sign. You didn't see anything happening. The sign's kind of big, so you looked at it a couple times, and you didn't see anything. And so eventually, you probably looked at that 50-mile-an-hour sign. Now, here's what you need to know. That first thing you looked at, that red car, disappeared. Your brain can track about 4 objects at any one time. We've spent billions of dollars, U.S. military and militaries around the world have spent billions of dollars trying to improve situational awareness of pilots and others to get them to see and pay attention to more than 4 things. It's a hardwired limit. The other thing you need to notice is even though you're paying attention to that 50-mile-an-hour sign and that change was right next to it, you didn't see it because you pay attention to objects, not regions of space. And it wasn't until I told you about that building that you noticed it. Now you'll notice it every single time. There's a cure. There's a cure. And there's good news. The good news is all we really need to do is put down our devices for a little bit and go outside. I want to talk very briefly about some research that I've done with the beautiful and talented Dr. Ruth Ann Atchley and some colleagues at the University of Utah, looking at what happens when people put down their devices and go outside for some period of time. This is research that's been covered in great places like Backpacker Magazine, which means you get to hang out with backpackers. It's been in a recent book called The Nature Fix. And basically what we did was we took people out into nature on long hikes and gave them these kinds of tasks. You've had some time to think about it. What's the word? The word's match. Tennis match, match and same are related, the head of a match. Now these aren't easy, so we gave these to people knowing they wouldn't solve very many of them. And when we did this and had people go out and hike in the Rockies and do really interesting things, what we saw is that the ability to solve these creative problems went up by 50%. We never see increases of 50% in anything in a psychological science research study, and yet we saw that here, and it's been replicated in other studies. We've recently replicated it with teams working together in office environments versus outdoor environments, and we still see that same improvement. What's also interesting is when you go outside, you become more emotionally intelligent. You become more sensitive to the emotions of others because the brain regions that are being distracted and that are being stimulated by nature actually help make you emotionally smarter. We took people out and gave them hikes and then had them do these kinds of weird word things where you say, "You smell bad," in a pleasant tone of voice, or it didn't match up, and ask them what the person was saying. People are a lot more emotionally in tune when they've been outside. We had those workers work in teams outside. They laughed twice as much. They collaborated more. They came to solutions faster, and the team was happier with those solutions than the people that were in the office environments. I think that part of the reason for this is because our phones are making us a little dumb and a little insensitive. The other doctor actually thinks that it's probably because nature is a really pleasant place to be and it's good for your brain. And the real answer is probably someplace in the middle. But I think middle's okay. In an era, and I loved how Tank said, wasn't your social network outside in one day? In an era where our social network used to be outside, where 4 generations ago a child might play in a very large area of space, and over time with subsequent generations, that area of space has shrunk down to a very small region. Maybe going back outside is something we all need. Attention is a gift that you give to yourself, and it's a gift that you give to people around you. And I appreciate the attention that you have given me here today. Thank you very much.